He rescued a silent tribal girl and was chosen as her spirit-bound mate. She lay helpless beneath the mesquite trees, her wrists bound tightly to a branch above her head, the rough bark scraping her skin raw. Her breath came in sharp gasps, not from weakness, but fury. Her torn dress clung to her damp skin, rain mingling with blood and dirt on her thighs. Yet her eyes, dark as obsidian, never looked away. Not from the men, not from their sneers. Feisty little thing, one of them laughed, fingers curling around his belt buckle with vile intention. Another spat near her face. The third stood back, licking his lips, eyes half-lidded in anticipation. They thought her broken. They were wrong. Silas Reed sat atop his horse, rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat, rifle steady in his hands. His face was carved from silence, but his eyes were a storm. If you're a sucker for cowboy love stories and wild, untamed Western tales like this one, drop a ton of ones and type "your place" in the comments to let us know you're riding with Wild West love. The rain arrived as abruptly as a broken curse, a misplaced scream in the parched lands of New Mexico in 1881. It wasn't the fine drizzle or the fleeting summer storm one might expect. This was a cascading wall of water, thundering down from a leaden sky, transforming the thirsty desert into a murky mirror reflecting silver lightning. Red dust billowed into vapor, mingling with the suffocating scent of damp earth and burnt ozone. It was a rare event, an anomaly so profound that even the creatures hidden deep within their burrows poked their heads out, bewildered. Inside his solitary forge, perched precariously in the desolate wilderness miles from the nearest town, Silas Reed paid no mind to nature's miracle. To him, rain was merely an inconvenience. It extinguished the fire in his hearth, soaked his precious coal, and turned the only track leading out to the world into a sticky quagmire. The rain hammered against the old tin roof of his shack like a relentless war drum, drowning out the familiar clang of his hammer. Silas brushed the damp strands of hair from his forehead, his calloused hand gliding over the cold anvil. Rain, or anything else, couldn't quell the smoldering fire within him, the fire of loneliness and resentment. It had been 3 years since that fateful night. 3 years since the greedy flames of the town had stolen his home, stolen Lily's clear laughter, and Sarah's warm embrace. 3 years since Silas Reed had died along with them, leaving behind only a breathing corpse, bearing scars not just on his skin but etched deep into his soul. They were constant reminders of his helplessness, of an irreplaceable loss. He had come to this desert not to find peace, but to escape the pitying glances, the hollow condolences, and, most importantly, to escape the memory that constantly threatened to consume him during long, sleepless nights. He sought the harshness of the wind, the sun, the isolation, to feel more keenly the emptiness inside. Hot steel and the ringing clang of his hammer were the only friends he allowed himself to have. A flash of lightning tore through the encroaching darkness, followed by a resounding thunderclap that shook the very ground. Silas flinched. He didn't care for thunder and lightning, but there was another sound, faint, piercing through the thick curtain of rain. A scream, a lonely, piercing scream, not of wind or wild animal. It was a human scream. He frowned. Rarely did anyone venture into this territory, especially not in such a storm. He felt a tremor of old instinct, a familiar tightening in his gut that he despised. For years, he'd lived by the gun, a gunslinger whose name carried weight in dusty saloons and on wanted posters. But after the fire, after losing everything that truly mattered, he'd cast off that life. He'd buried his reputation, traded his holster for an apron and his gun for a hammer. The Winchester, once an extension of his will, now lay gathering dust, a silent pact he'd made with himself. No more violence, no more blood on his hands. He was a rancher now, a lonely one, trying to forge a new life from iron and solitude, hoping to outrun the specters of his past. He hated the gun, hated what it represented, what it had made him, but the scream repeated, closer this time, laced with struggling sounds and crude curses. A woman, a human in distress. His mind screamed at him to stay hidden, to let the world consume itself. This wasn't his fight. He'd sworn off fights. Every time he'd drawn that weapon, it had brought nothing but pain, for himself and for others. His hands, now calloused from forging and honest labor, twitched, recalling the smooth, cold steel of a grip. The internal battle was fierce, a silent roar in his head. "Stay out of it, Silas. You promised yourself." Yet the scream came again, sharper, more desperate. It cut through the rain, through his resolve, through the years of self-imposed penance. It was a raw, primal sound that clawed at something deep within him, something he thought he'd buried forever. A flicker of decency, a buried sense of justice, or perhaps simply the unbearable echo of Sarah's last cries. He closed his eyes for a moment. The images of his burning home, of Lily's tiny doll abandoned in the yard, flashing behind his eyelids. He had been helpless then. He couldn't be helpless again, not when a human life was clearly on the line. With a ragged breath, a silent curse against himself, he walked to the corner where the old Winchester lay. His fingers brushed against the polished wood, a familiar, unwelcome sensation. It felt heavy, like a burden, not a tool. He picked it up, the weight of it in his hand a tangible reminder of the life he'd abandoned. He was breaking his own sacred vow, inviting the nightmares back. But the scream, it pushed him forward. He pushed through the flap of his shack, stepping into the deluge. His heavy boots slogged through the mud, the cold sensation of rainwater seeping through his old leather coat. The thick darkness and heavy rain acted as a shroud, concealing everything. He walked cautiously, following the direction of the scream, straining to listen. The sounds became clearer. 3 rough male voices, and one woman's desperate plea. They were in a small clearing, hidden beneath mesquite trees and cactus bushes. The weak light from a lantern, partially concealed under one man's coat, was just enough for Silas to make out the horrifying scene unfolding. 3 white men, roughly dressed, their hair plastered to their heads by the rain, surrounded a young woman. She was Native American, evident from her simple attire and long dark hair splayed wildly. She was struggling desperately, her screams muffled by harsh laughter and vulgar words. One man grabbed her hair, yanking her head back. Another was trying to tear at her simple dress, revealing tender skin. The third, with a disgusting grin on his face, reached out to cover her mouth. Silas's blood ran cold. The sight, though only a fleeting glimpse, instantly brought him back to that horrific night 3 years ago. Sarah's scream, Lily's cry, and the crushing helplessness as the fire consumed everything. He saw red, a blinding, furious red that had nothing to do with rage and everything to do with a desperate, primal need to prevent this kind of helplessness, this kind of suffering. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about not being a coward. It was about not letting another innocent life be devoured by the darkness. He hated the gun, hated the violence, but he hated the alternative even more. He took a deep breath, raising the Winchester to his shoulder. His aim wasn't at these brutes, but at the inky black sky above. He didn't want to kill anyone. He couldn't go back to that life. But he had to do something. He needed to create a shock, a warning roar. Crack! The sound of the shot ripped through the rain, louder even than the thunder. The bullet soared into the sky, leaving only a faint wisp of smoke that dissolved into the dense moisture. The crude laughter instantly died. The 3 men froze, looking at each other in confusion, not comprehending what was happening. They craned their necks, searching for the source of the sound, trying to identify their attacker. Silas said nothing. He stood there, his gun still pointed skyward, a vague dark silhouette in the pouring rain. He hoped the shot would be enough to scare them off, to spare him from having to do something worse. But these devils weren't easily intimidated. They were accustomed to operating by their own law of the jungle. The man who had been attempting to silence the girl roared in anger, pulling out a Bowie knife and lunging straight toward Silas. He was utterly fearless, only madness in his eyes. A flicker of pain crossed Silas's eyes. He had tried. He had truly tried to avoid this. But now, the enemy was charging, the knife glinting dangerously. He had no choice. He couldn't let him get near the girl. With a wave of self-loathing rising within him, Silas lowered the rifle, aiming directly at the charging man's leg. Crack! A pained grunt escaped the man as the bullet struck his thigh. He stumbled, collapsing into the mud, his knife flying from his hand. Blood began to spread on the damp ground. Silas felt a sharp jolt in his soul, as if a poisoned arrow had just struck him. He had broken his vow. He had added another bullet to his ledger, another stain on his life. The familiar sensation of self-disgust welled up, colder than the rainwater. The other two men, now utterly terrified by Silas's cold precision, looked at their comrade writhing in the mud. The madness in their eyes gave way to sheer horror. They didn't think, only turned and fled, tripping repeatedly in the muddy terrain, the splashing sounds of their footsteps gradually fading into the night. Silas didn't pursue them. His purpose had been served. Whether they lived or died no longer mattered. The young woman, now just a trembling, sobbing heap on the ground, gasped for breath. She no longer screamed, only choked sobs escaping her throat. Rain poured down on her small body, drenching her hair and torn clothing. Silas lowered his gun, letting it hang loosely by his side. He stepped closer, each step heavy with the weight of his choice. The gun felt like fire in his hand. The girl looked up, her dark eyes wide as they met his. In a flash of lightning he saw a large bruise on her temple and a deep cut on her arm. Her face was smeared with mud and tears, but her eyes, those eyes, held no gratitude. Instead, they were filled with profound pain, fear, and a deep, bottomless despair. She didn't say a word, just stared at him as if he were a phantom conjured from the darkness and the rain. Silas stood there, drenched, the cold from outside unable to quell the turmoil within. He had saved her, but at what cost to his own soul? He had broken his most solemn vow, pulled back into the very life he desperately sought to escape. As he looked at the fragile girl, an unwelcome, dangerous thought stirred within him. Perhaps the past wasn't something you could simply outrun. Perhaps, sometimes, it just caught up to you, in the form of a desperate scream in the rain. The next morning, the rain had subsided, leaving only heavy droplets clinging to leaves and the damp red earth. A thin mist hung over the valley, like a mysterious veil shrouding the freshly washed land. Inside the blacksmith's shack, the smell of hot metal and coal yielded to the earthy scent of dry herbs and damp soil. Silas sat by a small, flickering fire, staring at the girl. She had fallen asleep on the old leather blanket he had given her, her breathing even. The wound on her arm had been bandaged by him with clean cloths. Her face, no longer smeared with mud, revealed delicate features and the wild beauty of the desert. Silas didn't know her name. He also didn't know where she came from or why she was out there alone in the storm. He only knew he couldn't leave her, even when his common sense told him that all troubles began with unwanted interventions. The silence between them, stretching through the night, was not comfortable but an invisible wall. He was too accustomed to solitude, and the presence of this young woman, even motionless, made him uneasy. As dawn broke, the girl stirred. Her dark eyes slowly opened, looking directly at Silas. There was no scream, no panic, just a quiet, probing gaze. Silas responded with a curt nod, then pointed to the water and food he had prepared. The girl understood. She sat up, her movements somewhat reluctant, then accepted them. She ate slowly, small bites, her eyes frequently glancing at Silas. She didn't say a word. Silas didn't press her. He was, after all, not a man of questions. It wasn't until she finished eating that the girl softly opened her mouth, her voice hoarse but clear. "Ayani." Silas frowned. "Your name?" She nodded, a small flicker of emotion, something like relief, appearing in her eyes for the first time. "Ayani," she repeated, as if to confirm. "Silas," he responded, pointing to himself. "Silas Reed." And that was their first conversation. Brief, basic, yet it broke the wall of silence. Silas tried to ask her more, about where she came from, about those men, but Ayani just shook her head, her eyes distant again. The fear was still deeply etched within her, clearer than any physical wounds. He didn't press her further. Anyway, he wasn't a man for questions. Time passed. Another day, then another. Ayani slowly recovered. She didn't leave, and Silas didn't send her away. A strange, unspoken arrangement. She helped him with small chores around the forge, starting the fire, fetching water, picking up scrap iron. She worked in silence, sometimes humming strange melodies Silas had never heard, tunes that seemed to blend with the desert wind. He remained gruff, taciturn, but sometimes, when he was absorbed with a piece of hot metal, he would catch Ayani's gaze on him, not fearful, but a quiet, deep observation, as if she was reading something hidden deep within him. One afternoon, as Ayani sat outside, her eyes turned towards the distant red rock hills, where thin plumes of smoke rose from native encampments. Silas was sharpening a knife, the metal screeching dryly. Ayani suddenly stood up, her eyes wide. "They're coming," she whispered, her voice filled with apprehension. Silas looked up. He heard nothing, but Ayani's instincts seemed far more acute. Just minutes later, figures began to emerge from the western horizon. They were Native American warriors, riding bareback, adorned with feathered headdresses and carrying spears. They weren't coming from the direction of the town, but from deep within the native lands. There were about 10 of them, all armed. Silas's heart tightened. He immediately grabbed his rifle. This was their territory, and he was an intruder. But as the mounted group drew closer, something peculiar happened. They didn't attack. When they saw Ayani standing by Silas's forge, they immediately stopped, their eyes filled with a mixture of surprise and reverence. They didn't look at Silas with hostility, but with a strange caution, almost deference. Then, to Silas's utter astonishment, an older man, seemingly the leader, dismounted. He wore a large feathered headdress, with a wrinkled old face and sharp eyes. He walked directly to Ayani, paying no mind to Silas. "Ayani," he said, his voice deep but full of authority, "you have returned." Ayani nodded, her eyes welling up. "Father," Silas realized instantly. This was Ayani's father, and that meant this man was the tribe's chief, a significant figure in their spiritual system. Chief Tanabe, as Silas would later learn, was the keeper of ancient rituals, the voice of the ancestors' spirits. Tanabe looked at Ayani affectionately, then his gaze shifted to Silas. This time, there was no judgment or hostility, only a profound look, as if he was reading history in Silas's eyes. Silas tightened his grip on his gun. He didn't understand what was happening. Tanabe looked up at the sky, where gray clouds still lingered. "Rain," he said, his voice a whisper. "The rain called your name, and it called this man's name." He turned to his warriors, who remained silently mounted. Then he pointed to Silas, a solemn gesture. "This man saved Ayani in the rain," Tanabe declared, his voice echoing through the quiet space, broken only by the wind and the gentle patter of raindrops. "It is a sign. The ancestors have spoken. Their spirits have been bound by the rain, by the will of the Great Spirit." Silas stood frozen. Bound spirits? He was bewildered, looking at Ayani, then back at Chief Tanabe and the native men. He was a gruff blacksmith, a pragmatist who didn't believe in magic or spirits. He believed in steel, in the undeniable reality of life and death, in scars that could be seen and touched. What Tanabe had just said sounded insane, an ancient superstition. Number Silas mumbled, trying to deny it. I just helped her." Tanabe shook his head, his eyes full of understanding. "It is no accident, white man. You came here in the rain we have prayed for through 3 dry seasons. You reached out to save the one called by rain, Ayani. She was the rain healer, the one chosen by rain." Silas remembered Ayani's whispered words about being hunted. She bore a special lineage, a spiritual mark that white men considered heresy, while her people revered it. He had unwittingly stumbled into the middle of those 2 worlds. Chief Tanabe stepped closer to Silas, his gaze scrutinizing. "We cannot attack one whom the ancestors have chosen to bind spirits with our daughter. That would be an insult to the Great Spirit." He turned to Ayani, a rare smile gracing his face. "Return to the village, Ayani. Heal your wounds. And this man, he will come with you. The ancestors have spoken. Silas was stunned. Come with them? To their village? He, a white man, one who had witnessed so much animosity between the two races, to be welcomed into a native village? This went against everything he had ever known. He wanted to object, to turn and walk away, to return to his familiar solitude. But when he looked into Ayani's eyes, for the first time devoid of fear and replaced by a strange peace, he didn't know why, but there was an invisible thread, a pull of some kind, keeping him rooted. He looked around, bewildered. The rain had completely stopped. The sun began to shine through the dissipating clouds, creating a mystical halo over the hills. The air was fresh, cool, and thick with the scent of damp earth. Perhaps, he thought, perhaps it was all just a grand coincidence. But deep within his scarred heart, where the wounds still ached, a strange sensation was stirring, a feeling that destiny, perhaps, had indeed knocked on his door in the form of a scream in the rain. And he, whether he wanted to or not, could not leave. Not now, at least. The rain had stopped just before dawn. The desert lay quiet, blanketed in wet ash and the scent of scorched mesquite. Silas Reed sat beside a dying fire outside his makeshift forge, his body heavy with the weight of the night before. His shirt clung damp to his back, sleeves rolled to his elbows, revealing a burn scar that wrapped around his forearm like a brand of something long left behind. His rifle leaned against the wooden rail beside him, never out of reach. Inside, wrapped in an old wool blanket, Ayani lay motionless on a cot. Her breathing was steady now, but shallow. Fever had gripped her during the night, the wound on her leg inflamed and angry. She hadn't spoken since he'd cut her free from that tree. Not a word, just her eyes dark, unblinking, like polished obsidian, watching him through the silence. That afternoon, as Silas stirred the fire back to life, hoofbeats approached. 5 riders emerged through the trees, Apache warriors, boughs slung across their backs, faces stoic and unreadable. The one leading them was a woman older, her braided hair streaked with silver, eyes deep as canyon shadows. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, scanning the forge, then locked eyes with Ayani. "Ah, yeah," she murmured, voice almost breaking. Ayani stirred, slowly sat up, her lips quivering. Silas stepped between them instinctively, but the woman raised a hand not in threat, but in reverence. She was Ayani's mother, and a healer. Maybe more. There was no shouting, no accusations, only a stillness heavy with meaning. Then her gaze shifted to Silas. "You brought her back beneath the rain," she said in slow, careful English. "You heard the call, even if you didn't understand it." Silas wiped soot from his hands and stood up. "She needed help," he said flatly. "That's all. No one sees Ayani in the rain," one of the younger warriors muttered, half in awe. "Unless the spirits guide them." Silas frowned. "I don't believe in spirits. I believe in doing what's right." Though the healer didn't smile. She only nodded once. "Then come with us. Let's see where what's right leads you." They took Ayani with them, no force, no protest. She glanced once over her shoulder as she rode away, then looked forward. Silas hesitated. Something inside him itched like a fresh scar. He saddled his horse and followed. The journey was long. They crossed dry gullies and wind-worn ridges, moved past stone arches shaped by time and sand. The sun cast everything in hues of burnt gold. Eventually, they reached the edge of a hidden valley where smoke rose in delicate spirals from low circular huts made of timber and earth. The spirit village. As Ayani dismounted, the hum of the village changed. Children stopped chasing one another. Women at the fire pits paused. Men stood tall, faces unreadable. She walked with dignity, despite the limp in her step. And when she reached the center of the village, a tall man stepped forward, taller than the rest, wrapped in a cloak of feathers and rawhide, eyes like thunderclouds. He said nothing to Ayani. Instead, he looked at Silas. "You brought the rain," he said, "and you brought blood. Blood of men who deserve to die," Silas replied stiff. The man nodded slowly. "But rain doesn't just wash away blood, it binds. When a man saves a woman marked by the storm, the spirits call it sacred. She is not just rescued, she has claimed. Silas took a breath. I didn't claim anything. I'm no prophet, no spirit chosen. I just pulled her from hell. You spoke with your actions, the healer said, stepping beside the chief, and the ancestors heard you. The next day, Ayani invited Silas to walk the village. He moved awkwardly between houses made of packed clay and timber. People watched, wary but silent. Children peeked from behind wooden fences. He helped repair a water wheel, showed a boy how to grip a blade without slicing his hand. Slowly, suspicion began to fade into curiosity. That evening, they sat by the river. The water moved fast, swollen from the rain. Ayani said little. The sun sank behind the cliffs in a blaze of orange and crimson. "Why are you still here?" she asked finally, her voice soft. Silas didn't answer right away. Maybe because last time, I didn't get there in time. My wife and son died in a fire. I was 3 minutes too late. I've been trying to outrun those minutes ever since. Ayani looked at him long and deep. You think saving me balances that? He stared at the river. Number. But it's a start. That night, Silas went to the chief's dwelling. The shaman greeted him with silence, then pulled back a worn hide that covered part of the wall. Behind it was a tattered map, edges singed, marked with symbols in both Apache and English. Dried blood stained one corner. 3 years ago, the chief began, men came with documents, maps, promises. They said they needed to survey, said there'd be no harm. We trusted one man. He gave them this land's layout. Silas felt his chest tighten. That man was you, wasn't it? The chief asked quietly. I didn't know, Silas said. They told me it was routine, that it was just to prevent conflict. They came with rifles, fire, chains. My eldest son died defending our water. That survey killed him. Silas stepped back. I never meant... Spirits don't care what men mean. They care what men do. The chief didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His grief was a presence in the room, as thick as the smoke rising from the ceremonial fire. Silas couldn't sleep that night. He sat by a stump outside the village, head bowed, hands black with ash. The wind whispered like old memories. He saw the face of his son, eyes bright before the flames took them both. He saw the blood on Ayani's skin, the way she hadn't flinched when death came close. Maybe the spirits hadn't chosen him to honor him. Maybe they chose him to test him or redeem him. At sunrise, he began to work. He cleaned the old grave sites, rebuilt the fences, hauled stone to mend a broken path. Nobody told him to. Nobody helped him. But every nail driven, every board placed, was one step away from the man who once handed over maps and walked away. That afternoon, Ayani found him sitting beside the memory tree, a trunk carved with symbols and feathers tied to its branches. She sat beside him, close but not touching. If you could go back, she asked, would you still save me? He didn't answer for a long time. Then, finally, he turned. I don't think I saved you, he said. I think you saved me. Ayani reached out and took his hand, rough, scarred, reluctant. But it didn't pull away, and in that simple touch, under the sky no longer crying, the first root of something unspoken took hold. Not forgiveness, not love, but the space where both could one day grow. The desert wind howled like a warning ghost, as dusk painted the sky in molten gold and crimson. The mesa loomed behind them, casting long shadows over the sagebrush-covered plain. Josiah Cross, battered and bruised, held tight to the reins of his weary stallion, his other arm wrapped protectively around Maria's waist. She leaned against him, silent, her breath shallow, the blood from her shoulder soaking into the front of his shirt. Behind them, the horizon burned not with fire, but with the memory of gunshots, screams, and the near unthinkable cruelty she had almost endured. Josiah had arrived just seconds before the worst. A stranger once, now her savior. A lone cowboy with haunted eyes and a heart that had known more death than peace. But tonight, he had been something more. He had been the line between salvation and horror. They had ridden for miles without speaking, the gravity of what had almost happened hanging between them like the weight of a thundercloud. Only when the moon began its slow climb over the mountains did Josiah finally pull up the horse near a small ridge, beside a low fire pit half buried in dust. "Here," he murmured, sliding down and reaching for her. "We rest." She didn't resist when he lifted her gently from the saddle, though a soft cry escaped her lips as pain from her wound flared. He carried her to a patch of soft earth, laying her down with more reverence than most men reserved for prayer. For a moment, he just knelt beside her, jaw tight, eyes distant. Then she spoke. "You came back." 3 simple words, but they cut deep, deeper than any bullet. He swallowed hard, taking her hand. "I shouldn't have left in the first place." She looked at him, her face pale but fierce. "Why did you?" Josiah sighed, running a hand through his dirt-caked hair. "Because I thought I was poison. Because every woman I ever cared for either died or suffered just by being near me. I thought I was saving you." Tears welled in her eyes. "And what about me? You think being abandoned doesn't wound? That being left alone in this cruel world somehow keeps me safe?" His shoulders sagged, the weight of guilt settling in like the desert cold. "I was a fool," he whispered. "And a coward." Silence stretched between them as the fire he built crackled to life. He tore part of his shirt to bind her wound, his hands gentle, movements efficient but shaking. She watched him work, her expression unreadable. When he finished, he sat back on his heels. "They won't come after us tonight. Not after what I did." "What did you do?" she asked quietly. Josiah looked into the fire, the flames reflecting in his eyes like visions from hell. "I let go. I stopped running from the devil inside me, and I let him loose. They won't be hurting anyone again." Lang, her breath caught, part horror, part relief, but mostly trust. He didn't glorify it, didn't justify the blood on his hands. He simply told the truth, the kind of truth you only speak in the wilderness, under the judgment of the stars. Later that night, as the fire dimmed and the desert wrapped them in silence, she reached for his hand again. "Tell me what you see," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He frowned. "In what?" "In me." He stared at her, truly stared, for what felt like the first time in years. Past the bruises, past the dirt and the pain and the fear, past the woman nearly broken. "I see someone who's stronger than I ever was, someone who deserves peace and love, and a life that doesn't involve looking over her shoulder." She closed her eyes, letting the words wrap around her like a blanket. "I don't want to be afraid anymore." He nodded. "Then we run. South, past the border, start over." She opened her eyes. "Together?" The pause that followed was brief, but it meant everything. "Always," he said. By morning, the wounds still ached, but hope bloomed like a desert flower after rain. They rode together, this time not as strangers, nor as a savior and the saved, but as 2 broken souls who had bled enough, 2 hearts who had walked through the fire and come out the other side. Behind them, the West still burned, lawless and raw. But ahead, there was the promise of something else. Maybe not peace, maybe not safety, but love in its truest, most desperate form, and that would have to be enough. Okay, here's the rewritten ending in English, continuing the story of Silas and Ayani in the Native American village. Silas lived in the Native American village. His life, as a white man among the Apache, was far from easy. Although he was accepted for saving Ayani and deemed chosen by the ancestors by Chief Tenebe, pressure constantly weighed on him. Every curious glance from a child, every wary look from a warrior, reminded him that he was an outsider. He learned to hunt, to find water, to read tracks in the sand, but his own voice remained a foreign tongue amidst the ritualistic chants that echoed each night. Silas helped repair homes, sharpened dull axes, and taught the young men how to properly grip a blade. He strove to become a part of them, to alleviate the guilt he carried over the map that had led to the chief's son's death. He hoped these acts of atonement might wash away some of the stains from his past. Ayani was his only beacon. She didn't speak much, but her eyes always followed him, eyes that held no judgment, only deep understanding. Sometimes, sitting beside her under the moonlight, listening to the howl of wolves and the whisper of the wind, Silas felt a strange peace, one he hadn't known for 3 long years. Yet, that peace was always fragile. One afternoon, as Silas sat by the fire, Listening to Chief Tanabe recount ancient tribal stories, a young warrior named Kichi approached. Kichi was a skilled hunter, strong, and he made no secret of his envy and resentment towards Silas. "He comes here," Kichi said, his voice laced with contempt, with white man's tools, and carries dark spirits. "What has he done to deserve to be here?" Chief Tanabe simply gave Kichi a cold stare, but Silas knew those words weren't just the voice of one man. Many in the tribe felt the same. They saw him as the one who brought misfortune, the one who had indirectly caused the death of their kin. The invisible pressure bore down on Silas. He didn't belong here. His heart still carried the heavy burden of the past, and his mind still harbored the horrific memories of Lily and Sarah. One night, a fierce sandstorm swept through the valley. Sand swirled thick and blinding, obscuring the moon and stars. The next morning, when the storm cleared, Ayani awoke to find Silas gone. The blanket he usually slept under was still there, but he had vanished. She searched everywhere, but there was no trace. The entire village was in a state of confusion. Some believed he had fled, unable to bear the harsh life here. Others thought he had been taken by an evil spirit. Kichi looked triumphant, saying he had known all along this white man couldn't be trusted. Ayani didn't utter a word, but she felt a cold dread creep up her spine. She believed he would return. She felt the invisible thread that bound their souls. Silas was gone, but he hadn't fled. That night, as the sandstorm raged, he'd heard faint cries from a distance. They weren't Apache voices, but the desperate pleas of white settlers. Instinct had taken over. He couldn't just leave them. He knew he might get into trouble, but his conscience wouldn't allow him to ignore their plight. He'd ridden his horse, battling through the sandstorm, following the sounds. Eventually, he found a stranded pioneer family. Their wagon had overturned, a man was gravely injured, and children shivered with fear. They were lost, out of water and food, and a small gang of outlaws was lurking nearby. Silas had to fight. He picked up his Winchester again, using skills he had sworn never to employ. He protected the family, drove off the outlaws, bandaged the man's wounds, and guided them to a safer path. He spent the entire week helping them, ensuring they had enough water and provisions to reach the nearest town. Every day that passed, he thought of Ayani, of her eyes, and of the silent promise he'd made to himself. He knew he had to return, but he couldn't abandon those in need. Throughout that week, Silas found no peace. He grappled with recurring nightmares of his past, the fire, the screams. He thought he'd escaped that man, the violent gunslinger of old, but then he'd taken up the gun again, fired. Had he truly changed, or was he just deceiving himself? Finally, after ensuring the family was safe, Silas rode back. He rode tirelessly, across dusty, rocky trails. When he saw the familiar plumes of smoke rising from the Apache village, a sense of relief washed over him, mixed with anxiety. Would they accept him back? Or had he shattered the fragile trust they had placed in him? Silas returned at dusk, when the flickering lights of the teepees were visible. He was disheveled, his clothes torn, his face grimy with dust. As he entered the village, everyone stopped, staring at him. A murmur spread through the air. Kichi stepped forward, his eyes full of challenge. "Where have you been?" Kichi demanded, his tone accusatory. "You abandoned us. You are not to be trusted." Silas looked Kichi directly in the eye. "I abandoned no one," he said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "I helped those in need." He recounted his story, plainly, without embellishment or excuse. He spoke of the stranded pioneer family, the outlaws, and the necessity of his intervention. He wasn't seeking forgiveness, just stating the truth. Chief Tanabe listened in silence. When Silas finished, he stepped forward, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder. "You have returned," he said, his voice filled with respect. "You chose the right path. The ancestors tested you, and you did not disappoint them." Kichi scowled, clearly displeased, but he could say no more. Chief Tanabe's decision was final. Ayani walked towards him, her eyes devoid of reproach or doubt, only relief and a deep underlying sorrow. She touched the wound on his arm, then gently placed her hand on his cheek. "I knew you would return," she whispered, her voice clear for the first time in days. That night,